each of you are in your films in different degrees. Jeff, let me start with you. As I flubbed on stage earlier, you had previously made a film called Chasing Ice, which was following a photographer who was involved in this incredible project to film glaciers that we could, through time-lapse photography, we could watch the vanishing of our polar regions. And forgive me, it's been a couple years since I've seen that film. I don't recall you being a part of that film. Am I right or wrong?
Very briefly.
Okay. So when you began this project, Chasing Coral, did you think it was going to be similar? Did you know that you were going to wind up in it?
Yeah, for both of these projects, I didn't particularly want to be in the film and wasn't trying to be in the film. With Chasing Ice, I think we approached them both in the same way. We actually went back to our editor and our producers, and I had no opinion on my role in the film. We had done an interview with me where our editor had interviewed me, and we just knew we wanted to capture that just in case at the time, based on certain story points. But we wanted to have as little of me in the film as possible, but there were certain things that I did and that, from the team perspective, my voice was necessary in advancing the story. And so there were certain elements that we kept in for those reasons. So in the case of Chasing Coral with this project, our team had to build these time-lapse cameras. This phenomenon hadn't been documented ever before. We were working with these scientists. We knew that this thing was happening in the oceans. We knew that corals were changing. And based on our collaborators and our team, like it sort of became our burden to build this technology to be able to capture this. So in that whole process, we were documenting everything. Every person on the team that was involved in building, testing, iterating on the cameras, they needed to withstand deep pressures in the ocean. They needed to withstand. We invented the world's first underwater solar panel application. We were inventing lots of different technology and photographic techniques, and that was something where my background in cinematography was part of that conversation. And so when we were getting closer and closer to the edit, we knew that because this technology and the techniques ended up becoming like the key to making the footage work, we wanted to include that whole backstory as well. So the framework for me was honestly as little of my role as possible, but what was necessary to move the story forward when necessary.
Okay, I'm going to come back and talk to you more about what was involved when you were on camera. Yancey, let me move to you. You have a long history before making this film of working at POV, the PBS strand, whose very name expresses a point of view. So you had worked shepherding other filmmakers' projects into broadcast and through their production. But you had your own story to tell about the death of your brother, William Ford, in a shooting on Long Island. And you began the project several years ago. It was a long journey to make that project. And I wonder, how much you understood from the beginning that you were going to have to be a key voice in this.
Well, it's funny because at the beginning of the process, I wrote a list of 10 rules for the film. And the first rule was that Yancey will never appear on camera in Strong Island. We shot these interviews, and with my intention was only ever to use my VO from these interviews, right?
You say you shot these interviews, shot interviews with your mother?
Yeah, we shot interviews with my mother, with my sister, with my brother's two friends, with two other characters. And we also shot interviews with me. And I think in the director's kind of, folly, I said to myself, well, we won't use the picture, but just in case, right? I was dead set on not being in the film. But after the watchdown, and the decision that I made that led me to reimagine what the film would be, I ultimately wound up literally front and center in the film. And I think that one of the things that that my character actually does do that no other characters in the film can provide is a kind of connective tissue between characters and this sort of black void where my character exists is divorced from time. And so it enabled us in the edit to use my character where, where it was most necessary and where it helped the story both ask additional questions, but also, like Jeff said, to sort of advance the narrative of the film.
And I'm curious about that process when you were being interviewed in the film. Who was doing the interviewing? How was that process being guided?
Sure. Well, I directed the crew who interviewed me before I sat down in the chair. So Rob Moss, who is a filmmaker, Same River Twice, prolific, incredible guy. Rob Moss interviewed me the majority of the time, and then my producer, Jocelyn Barnes, also interviewed me. I gave the crew a few instructions. I didn't want to know what questions they were going to ask me, and so I never knew. And I told my DP not to stop rolling if I called cut. The third thing I did was to build a wall of sound blankets between me and the crew. So if you can imagine that I'm on this side, on the stage, and in between me and everyone else, sound, DP, AC, Rob, monitor, producer, everything. The only thing that I can see are 2 lenses and 2 tape marks. Because in order to answer questions that I wasn't necessarily prepared to answer and talk about things that I wasn't necessarily prepared to talk about, I needed to be as alone in that space as I possibly could. And by creating this bubble, I was able to do a few things. I was able to say things I'd never said before. I was able to actually make connections between what happened to my brother and contemporary American issues in real time. And I was also able to sort of express what most audiences who know about these murders from social media don't actually get to understand, which is that these killings take out entire families. These killings, they are explained away with the same narrative that's as old as the country. And doing that alone is much, much easier than doing that in front of an audience, even though ultimately the audience was meant to be, many more people than the 7 in the room with me on the days that we shot.
So my choice of sequencing this has been deliberate, from Jeff, who's somewhat in his film, to Yancey, who's very present in his film, and now to Brian, who's got like needles and piss and everything all over his film. Brian, there must have been no deliberation at the beginning of your film about whether you're going to be in it or not. Your film begins as almost like a Morgan Spurlock type experiment of you doping, and then it goes in a far different direction, as we see foregrounded in this trailer. So what were your thoughts in embarking on this project and putting yourself at the center of your film?
Actually, I was not planning to be at the center of my film. Have
you seen your film?
Yes, I've seen it, but initially, I did not create a 10 list, and my number one thing was I will never be on camera, as Yancey said. But in the conception of the film, my original idea was that I was going to find a pro athlete who was currently racing, and convince this guy that for the greater good, that he would essentially dope, we would assemble a team around him to advise him, and then he would get through the system. We would expose this in the film, and basically, even though he had participated in this, it would not cost him his career because he did it for the greater good to show that the system was a failure. So that was the original conception.
No one was beating down the door to be that person?
Exactly. And as you started to look at that, it became harder and harder in the sense of, okay, what athlete is actually gonna do this, even if they are themselves doping? So then I had an idea that I would find a top level, like recently retired professional that had been in like Tour de France's and things like that, and have him do that. And what he would actually do would be his own program, what he had done, except he would do it on camera, we would document it, we'd get him into races, we'd, and again, show that the system essentially doesn't work. But what I quickly realized in that process of exploration was that I was going to be unable to essentially have control of what that outcome was going to be. And I said to myself, well, I could get this ex-pro and he would agree to do this, but A, how am I going to pay him? B, if I pay him, it looks like there's some sort of collusion involved. It can be open to, hey, what did you do? Or this was about money. And C, I thought to myself, well, I've got a rogue element that I'm embarking on this journey that's going to be a couple years, and how do I know this guy isn't going to quit? How do I know this guy isn't going to mess something up? How do I know that I'm going to be able to control the subject? And through all of that, I ultimately decided, well, I'm the one who's most passionate about this story. I'm the one who's, really feeling like I want to explore this and expose what I saw as a completely broken, fraudulent system. And so I said, hey, I'll be the one to do this, kind of in that Morgan Spurlock way, and supersize me. And I said, hey, we haven't seen this done on camera. And at least if I'm in the film, I know that I'm not going to quit. I know that if whatever happens, I'm not going to say, hey, I'm done. And that was ultimately the decision of why to put myself in the film.
Now, I want to pause here for a second and say that these three films each take on something incredibly important, and the fact that the filmmakers are in it is probably not the most interesting thing to say about the film. We've got a film about environmental devastation. We've got a film about the Russian doping program and the incredible power structure of a government to go after an individual. And we've got a film about the racial dynamics in America that dictate our justice system. I'm sure that I hope you all get to see these films and engage with those issues. But here at Doc NYC, I'm very interested in the dynamics that make these films work, and that's why I want to kind of plunge a little deeper into the style questions that I'm asking about here. So, Jeff, having made the decision that you and your team are characters in this film, talk about how you choose how to film yourself and when to film yourself. I mean, if you're the cameraman but you're also in the film.
Yeah. Which is great. And I'd love to share just one thought, because I actually haven't spent that much time thinking about filmmakers being in the film itself. And just after hearing your comments, I think it seems in my mind right now, there are three sort of categories when filmmakers are in the films. It's either when they've experienced something themselves, that it's only their story that can be shared, or when they did something themselves, that story needs to be shared. And there is sort of this third category where filmmakers are the narrator or the host who's sort of like hand-holding you and carrying you through the story. And there's sometimes I feel like the filmmaker may or may not need to necessarily be in the film, but I think in all these three cases, like, we experienced something firsthand or did something firsthand that is the essential element of the story. The films don't work without that component in it. So in our case, we had this curiosity. We wanted to capture this phenomenon happening in the ocean. We knew that these corals were changing. They were turning white. When a coral reef is healthy, it's vibrant and colorful, massive colors, countless fish species, all of that. It's the epitome of life on the planet. It's teeming with life. And we were learning from the scientists that as the water temperature gets warmer, those corals turn white. And if they turn white, they get stressed, and that's a It's a huge, huge visual signal of climate change, and it's been happening only for the last couple decades, and it's happening all around the world. So that's what we knew going into this project, and we knew that if we could somehow capture that process of healthy colors turning white, that could potentially be a signal and this visual evidence of climate change. If we could get that out there, maybe we can combat some of the skepticism that still exists in this country around climate change. And that's based on what we learned with Chasing Ice. Like, the visual evidence is more successful than any debate, any argument, any chart, any graph. If you can show people pictures of the changes happening, that's sort of the golden ticket there. So we were wanting to build these cameras, and we worked with these great engineers and technicians on how to build these camera systems. And once we went down that path, we really tried to document as much of that as possible. And with Chasing Ice, I actually did most of the filming myself. I was following James when we were doing the time lapses in the Arctic. I was able to shoot that as a one-person, like, one camera, zoom lenses, wireless mics. I basically did all run-and-gun shooting on my own there. And when we were starting this project, it was very clear, like, we couldn't do that anymore. When you're on a boat getting the equipment prepped to go install, you have to switch all your physical gear from shooting dry and everything staying dry to now you're rigged up in a wetsuit and scuba gear, and you need your camera in an underwater housing, and that transition alone takes like a half hour to get prepped and ready. So very, very quickly we realized that we needed a lot more people. So on most of these trips, we ended up having an underwater crew and a topside crew. One crew just dedicated to the land and shooting on boats, and then another crew that was dedicated to waterproof cameras, rolling into the water and capturing all of that. And we didn't know, we knew we were going to have some challenges. We didn't know how many challenges there would be and how complicated it would be. We actually had anticipated finishing the entire film a year earlier, but because of camera tech complications, because we were never really in the right place at the right time for the first few months, we were working with scientists to get the best, most accurate data, reading data right off of like NASA satellites, getting the predictions as to this part of the ocean is abnormally warm. We think corals might bleach in this region. We don't know if it's going to be bad or really bad. We would go down there, we would set up our cameras. There were times where we had the camera pointed at one healthy coral and we thought that might bleach, but the coral next to it bleached and turned white, but the one in our shot stayed perfectly healthy and fine. That was extremely infuriating. But that whole process there, and I think this is the process of documentary film, like you don't necessarily know where the story is going to go or end up. And the challenge there was, we have to film everything, and you have to film everything as if it's going to make the fun.
To document the story of everybody that I was talking to. So in a lot of cases, especially with Gregory and my coach who I was working with in Colorado, but I was in Los Angeles, or my Dr. Kevorkian doping doctor who was also in Colorado and I was in Los Angeles, these Skype calls became a way for us to keep in communication and that I could film. And in those environments, again, it was essentially just me, and I would set up 2 Canon C300 cameras. I'd angle them essentially in my kitchen or wherever I was, and I'd set up these cameras and then also have the Vixia, and then I would do a screen capture to capture what was on the screen as well. And that was, again, kind of a process of just myself. I would mic myself, and I would get set up for these Skype calls. And there were ultimately probably a couple hundred of these that were grueling for my editorial team to look through. And for about the first year, they were all like, what are these Skype calls? What are these Skype calls? What are these Skype calls? And I'm like, look, guys, I'm telling you, there's stuff in these Skype calls. It's amazing. And then one day I remember Mark Monroe, who helped me write the project, finally sat down and started watching these Skype calls, and he calls me up and he's like, Brian, this is the movie, the Skype calls. I'm like, I know, Mark, I know. These are amazing. And so that process took forever because I had so much footage of these Skype calls, and these Skype calls, nobody on my team was there to shoot. So I didn't have my cinematographer there. I didn't have an assistant camera. I didn't have a sound guy there. It was basically me just setting up every day and filming these Skype calls, so nobody knew what was in those Skype calls other than me.
And editors hate reviewing Skype calls.
Yeah, and so it was incredibly tedious. tedious when we got into the editorial, because I was going through and going, oh yeah, this Skype call, that happened, and I had documented, but you know, that was a very long process in editorial to find all that, and that exploration. There's parts in the film where I'm filming these Skype calls with Gregory, and we realized that there's Russian going on, and so I had a Russian translator who was working for a year and a half, and all of a sudden she'd go, oh my God, do you know what they just said in Russian? And so half of all these things we were finding wasn't even about the Skype calls. It was stuff that was going on off camera that were in Russian, and things that we were recording that we didn't realize at the time had meaning. And then on the formal production stuff of the interview, those were all very planned. And so I'd go with my cinematographer, Jake Swanko, and we would shoot everything on basically C300s. We used some Sony cameras, and we would travel and set up, you know, LED panels and light, and you know, and create those environments for the interviews. And those were very, you know, planned and regimented. And then all the action stuff, again, was always with a cinematographer and a team, and we would use a variety of car mounts. We'd shoot out the back of cars. All the stuff, all the footage in Europe is Jake, and I had another guy literally on the backs of motorcycles following me on this race through the French Alps, and they're going 80 miles an hour out off the backs of motorcycles filming. And it was incredibly dangerous, because had they been in a crash or I'd been in a crash, and I remember there was one part where I'm literally going down this mountain in the Alps, and I look down at my cycling computer, and I'm going 110 kilometers an hour. And Jake is on the motorcycle like 2 feet in front of me, and I looked up to him, I'm like, this is insane. And so there was so many different medium that we used through the process of filming. And then when we went back in post, that's where we started really picking up all this B-roll. And so we'd go out and shoot with drones, and we'd get drones and get all these landscape shots and get all these overheads of Los Angeles. And Jake, again, and myself would go out, and we would just shoot days of different B-roll. And all that B-roll ended up kind of filling in these moments that we didn't have, or these moments where you heard Gregory, you heard a Russian official, you heard me, but it felt more cinematic to not be on camera. And that B-roll process was ongoing, and we shot B-roll over a couple of years wherever we were.
So in the last 15 minutes we have here, I want to kind of shift away from the fact of you guys being in your films and talk about the effects of the films themselves since they've been released into the world. Each one of these films, as I said, is about an incredibly important subject. You being in these films is part of the engine that helps tell this story. But let's talk about the story that's being told and how it's been received by audiences. Jeff, what have you experienced being on the road with Chasing Coral, putting it in front of audiences?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of how to summarize a lot of different thoughts for this purpose. When we were on the road with Chasing Ice 5 years ago, we had lots of people ask us questions after the screening was over, still curious about climate change and global warming and the science. And but I heard this, and oh, I heard that. And like, there was so much more skepticism 5 years ago. Of all of our screenings, starting at Sundance to today, maybe there's been one question following Chasing Coral where people were still like skeptical or curious about climate science. And that's been just a huge fascinating shift in and of itself. We've done a lot of screenings of the film in conservative communities as well, where we're really trying to like get outside of my echo chamber, right? Just acknowledging that all of us have our own little echo chambers that we're in. But we've been really trying to get beyond that to explore and see, look, we didn't make this film for me or for the environmental choir or the environmental communities. We really want this film to be designed and built for communities far beyond that. So we've done a bunch of screenings. We're doing a pilot campaign right now in South Carolina, where we've done a good number of screenings in churches and schools and community groups in South Carolina. We're right now fundraising to invest for an entire 2018 campaign just focused in South Carolina to see how far can we go with this film at shifting consciousness around climate. Not just with this film, we're bringing in a bunch of other friends' films that are on climate. So we're building a network of environmentally themed films that can all play a role in shifting mindset. So we've been blown away by the response there. My favorite, just some anecdotes. There was somebody who on their profile on Twitter, they self-describe as being alt-right, and yet they were promoting chasing coral. And like that was really interesting. Like that's perfect. Like that's what we want. I want more people. It
wasn't a bot?
As far as I know, it wasn't a bot, but if it was a bot, that's awesome too. Like now, if bots are promoting chasing coral, even better. But so that was one example. We had some friends, some partners of ours at the Nature Conservancy, and they were having a meeting in North Carolina where they were talking about security, global security, national security around climate. And they were having this event, and some random person came into their event that day and was saying, I'm about to meet the Republican senator, what should I be talking about? And it sort of took the entire group by surprise, like, who are you? How'd you get here? What's your story? And it turned out that his son had seen Chasing Coral at a screening that we did at a school, brought the film back to their family, their whole family watched it. This dad was an avid scuba diver and really cared about the ocean, but knew nothing about what was happening regarding coral bleaching. And he also happened to be a big conservative donor and had donated a lot of money to Republican candidates. And here was a person who supports the Republican Party and now wants to be a champion for climate policy. Like, that's the silver bullet in my mind. If we're going to ever address this issue properly, the rest of the world is all in accordance with Paris. The rest of the world gets this bigger picture. Like, there is no business as usual if we don't address global warming now. Our window and our opportunity to address it is small and it's closing. And the only real political problem that we are facing still is one political party in this country. And there are a number of people within the Republican Party who are sticking their necks out and breaking against party lines and saying, look, I get it, we get it, the science is there, and this is how we as Republicans can address this. This is how the Republican Party can solve this problem. That, in my mind, is the hope. That's the silver bullet. When we get to a tipping point where we can break down this ridiculous party difference on the science here and have both parties promote it and support it by whatever means. Like, there's a science problem and there's a policy problem. Like, the science is there. We don't have to keep debating whether or not this is happening, but we can keep debating, like, how do we then leverage policies that work with both Republicans and Democrats to address this appropriately. And that's the conversation that we're trying to push, and it's been amazing to see the film get out there, the response from the public, the support, and the opportunity. So it's been kind of mind-blowing.
Yancey, with all three of these films premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January and then came out to the more public release in different stages. Yours came out just a month ago.
September 1st.
Went up on Netflix. I'm curious to know, what you've engaged with audiences around this. I'm, both how people talk about their own similar stories, perhaps, or their reckoning with those kinds of stories. And I'm also curious specifically about your own specific story, if in the community of Long Island, the story being out in public has stirred anything else up.
So I'll answer your second question first. The film, it's been out for about a month now. I haven't heard back from Long Island. We're planning a large screening at the community college in the town next to mine in April of next year, which I think will be the thing that really gives the film its biggest footprint locally. So that remains to be seen. I can tell you this. That at every screening since our premiere at Sundance, there has been at least one person in the audience to self-identify as a survivor of homicide. At least one. And these are including the screenings for members of the Academy. So one thing that I've learned since the release of Strong Island is that we are a culture that has always shamed the survivors of violence. We are a culture that has always sort of decided that self-defense is a matter of opinion as opposed to a matter of law. I've had, I think at the premiere at Sundance, or maybe the screening that Malia Obama was at, I had someone stand up and say, I was a prosecutor in the Bronx DA's office for 18 years. Something very wrong happened here. So everywhere I go with this film, it is an affirmation for audiences of what, particularly communities of color, of what these communities have always known, but have never been believed about, which is that there is unchecked violence against unarmed black and brown people that is as regular as the sunrise, right? Now we have organizations like the Marshall Project and the Brennan Center and others that are crunching data, including the Marshall Project has crunched data that includes the year that my brother was killed, and found that there is, white people, white Americans who kill unarmed black Americans are 8 times as likely to be deemed justified in those shootings. The national average, regardless of who kills who, is 2%. So what I have seen and what our team continues to see is that wherever we go with this film and whomever we hear from, right, through social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or email, we are constantly hearing from people who say, I lost so-and-so, I lost a such and such, the person who killed them claimed self-defense. And there seems to be no, reason in reasonable fear anymore. It's just fear. So one of the things that we will continue to, talk about, with the release of Strong Island is that we need to get back to, in our judicial system, remembering that it's not just you can kill someone if you are afraid of them, right? Because if I had that privilege, right, I could have killed at least one person this month, right? And that would never, ever, ever be allowed to happen if straight fear were the standard in our legal system. So, the need for a return to the valuation of life on an equal footing, that is what we hear back from communities. And frankly, people are tired of this environment now where people are finally crunching data, and data itself is now being questioned as legitimate, right? So first, lived experience is illegitimate. Then the authentication of lived experience by other people from outside the community is illegitimate. And now that we have facts that are backing up, the stories of racial discrimination and disproportionate everything through our judicial system, now that we have those facts and that information, all of a sudden, facts are illegitimate. So we are sort of moving straight into this place where people are going to say, enough. You cannot continue to deny this. My brother's story is 25 years old. It could happen tomorrow. And the exact same reasons, the exact same points would be made to justify his death.
Brian, in the case of your film Icarus, the Russian doping expert who came out because of your film, because of your relationship with him, broke the news in the New York Times, as we see in the trailer, and is currently under a witness protection program. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Protective custody, yes.
Okay. Can you bring us up to date on his state and what the film being out in the world has meant to this issue?
This is, today in today's New York Times, there are 2 large stories because of this film and this story. The first story is that Vladimir Putin yesterday held a press conference saying that the doping scandal is a result of a United States conspiracy against Russia, and that the doping scandal is America's way to involve itself in the upcoming Russian elections and to try to take Putin out of power. This is real. The second thing that was reported in the New York Times yesterday is that Russia is formally asking the Trump administration to extradite Gregory Rodchenkov, who they are blaming 100% for this scandal, while denying all of the thousands and thousands and thousands of documents of evidence that unequivocally prove not only did this happen, but that the Russian ministry was aware of this, that Gregory was answering to Vitaly Mutko, who has been promoted to be the vice president of Russia, to get out of harm's way, despite forensic evidence, despite DNA, despite science. I mean, it is unimaginable. And this fraud was perpetrated against every clean athlete on planet Earth for the last 40 years. Russia stole thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of medals. They went into world sport over the last 40 years, and basically any single athlete who was competing clean in those games were robbed. And here we have a country essentially denying all accountability. And not only are they denying all accountability, they're trying to persecute the one person who was brave enough to come forward with the truth about this, and on top of that, now blame the United States for this conspiracy. And this is happening right now, in real time, in today's news. And the takeaway from this is there any doubt whether or not Russia is meddling into our political process, whether or not they are able to hack our elections, whether or not they are involved in geopolitics in a malfeasant way? I think the answer is incredibly clear from watching this film. The second takeaway of this is, what are we as a society going to tolerate? Not just on the playgrounds or battlefields of sport, which is actually geopolitics of countries coming together, in war without weapons, but in the political landscape. Are we going to allow a foreign power to come in and shape our government processes? Are we going to allow a foreign power to sit there and lie and place fake news and place ads on Twitter and Facebook, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and corrupt our democracy? Are we going to allow this? And what's going on in the current U.S. administration? And the biggest thing is, what we are seeing is that despite all of us believing that we're living in this kind of democratic process, we're seeing that corruption ultimately wins, that the truth is not important. And it doesn't matter how much truth there is, that there is a way around the truth, and that there doesn't seem to be a punishment for essentially crimes of this sort of caliber, at this sort of level, that world leaders are able to essentially, by denying and denying and denying, make this go away. And when I look at what's going on in our country right now, I'm sitting here going, how much evidence do we need? How much more do we need as a country to be infuriated about what's going on? And this is mirroring itself in Russia. And I think of the film as a story not about doping in sports, but a story of the corruption of truth and what ultimate power can do, and the cost of essentially telling the truth in the society that we're living in today. And this story is playing out every day, and I'm incredibly fearful for Gregory, because what we're seeing is that telling the truth and having the bravery to come forward to do that has a very, very severe price. And I'm hoping that that he's going to be okay, but that also that our government isn't going to acquiesce to Russia's demands to extradite him, because in so doing, they would create a situation where nobody has any safety to come to the United States ever again to tell about the wrongdoings of their government and know that the United States would be a safe place and a protective environment in which they can expose these truths. And so it's a very pivotal time, and this is playing out as I sit here right now.